Montreal, what a great city. I would move there if only I spoke French. I can't tell you how many people I know who have said something like that to me. For those who don't know, I'm an English-speaking Canadian. I grew up in the city of Winnipeg, Manitoba, in the heart of English-speaking Canada. Though in fact we do have a small French-speaking community called St. Boniface, which goes to show there are pockets of French speakers across Canada, but they're very, very small compared to Quebec, which is the French-speaking province in which Montreal is by far the largest city. But Montreal is in an interesting situation in that it's an international city with people from all over. There's French speakers, there's English speakers, there's Spanish speakers, there's Arabic speakers. It's a cosmopolitan place within a province that is strictly French. And this begins to show you the layers of complexity around the language issue in Montreal. So here's the plan for today's video, okay? I'm gonna try and do the unthinkable. I'm gonna try and make a video that both empathizes with French speakers in Montreal and English speakers in Montreal. We got a lot to get to here. It's gonna be a wild ride. Part 1. When in Rome, do as the Romans. The Quebecois perspective is basically like, they will say, listen, we didn't agree to be Canadian in the first place. We were basically colonized by the British and forced into this situation where we are now like habiting side by side in one country. But Quebec never agreed to that country. They didn't actually agree to like the Canadian laws and the constitutional system when it was all set up. They've kind of like agreed to be a nation within a nation, which is how Quebec is now seen. Legally, it is a nation within Canada. And as such, it has its own kind of like rights and laws and things like that. And it's given a bit of autonomy legally. And that's a whole political discussion I won't get into here. But like Quebec is a special case, given that historical context of, just the differences between the French and English settlers in Canada. And so because of that, people say, listen, we never wanted to speak English. We never wanted to be part of your culture. We wanted to do our own thing, and we've always wanted to do our own thing. And now English speakers from other parts of Canada want to move here and turn our place more British, more English, more what we never wanted to be part of in the first place. No. You come to Quebec, you learn our way of doing things. You learn French. You adapt to Quebecois society. You don't turn Montreal into another Toronto and Vancouver. We won't allow that. That is the hardcore, I almost said separatist. There are some people who want to separate, but not even the separatist perspective, just the cultural preservation of Quebec perspective. And understand it. And honestly, I sympathize with it quite a bit. I do sympathize with it quite a bit. And I never fully understood that perspective as much until someone put it like this. They explained it, I think it was an internet comment. I can't remember where I saw this, but basically they said, Quebec is the last French-speaking area in a continent surrounded by English. There were other places like Louisiana, which historically had French speakers. They're gone. They were assimilated. It's now all English speakers. And so they're like, hey, we're it for this whole continent. You know what I mean? In a world where English is the de facto global language, we're holding on. And I think the real fear they have is if they lose the language, they're going to lose the culture too. And the cultural differences of Quebec is something more intangible. It's harder to put your finger on, but like you feel it. The way of life, the holidays, the food. I don't know how to explain it. Like people often say Quebec is more European. It's more than just the language. It's the mentality. It's a different way versus the English, and it always has been. French speakers and English speakers have always had a different way of doing things. And Quebec wants to hold on to that different way. So they're like, hey, you move here, you speak French, you become Quebecois, we're cool with that. If you don't, go back to Toronto, go back to Winnipeg,
That's it! Back to Winnipeg!
Part 2. But wait, this is Canada, right? Now on the other side, there are the English speakers from other cities, like Winnipeg, like Toronto, like Vancouver. who grow up being taught that Canada is a bilingual country. We have two languages, English and French. Some people speak English, some people speak French. The government speaks both. And so you have this idea of like, well, yeah, Montreal, okay, so that's Quebec. They speak more French there. But we have two languages in Canada, right? So I can go there because I speak one of the languages. I speak English. And so no one's going to give me problems for speaking English in Canada, right? And so you move to somewhere like Quebec, and then you realize like, oh, wait, is bilingualism real? Is this country really bilingual, or do we just tell ourselves that to feel good about things? Because it doesn't seem like we're that bilingual. Now, that's a strange comment to make, but what I mean by that is Montreal rather, many people speak English and French, but they still want French to be prioritized in most cases. And so, and like think of it the other way. Think of it if you're a French speaker and you go to anywhere past Ottawa, really, or even in Ottawa, the capital city. Some people there speak French. But if you only speak French and you don't speak English, you're going to have a hard time. And if you only speak French and you don't speak English and you go to Vancouver, you're going to have an impossible time. Like literally, it's going to be like going to Japan. Actually, I was going to say it's like going to Japan but not speaking Japanese, but it's even harder because some people in Japan obviously speak English. But would they speak French? No. And so English speakers have a kind of a biased perspective because English speakers expect people to speak English everywhere we go. You go to Japan, you expect the hotel receptionist to speak English because you're a tourist and I speak English, like speak my language. You know, anywhere you expect people to speak English. But French speakers don't have that luxury. They have to learn English to communicate, to travel, even within their own country, Canada. And so when people say Canada's bilingual, I could see French-speaking Quebecois being like, yeah, that's always been a lie. You guys just say that to try and keep this country together, but we can't go anywhere speaking French. You expect to go anywhere speaking English. And so that's the situation why I really come to sympathize with French speakers in Quebec, even as an English speaker coming to this province. With that being said, part 3, it's even more complicated than that. Now that I've annoyed all the English-speaking viewers, let me also annoy the French-speaking viewers. I'm going to annoy everyone before this video is done, I promise. With that being said, I think all this historical context I just mentioned makes it so a lot of French Canadians are overly hostile towards individuals who might be making an effort to actually integrate into Quebec. And people like myself, like I have nothing, I'm not making hater videos about Quebec. I have nothing but love for this province. It's a great part of this country that I grew up in. And I'm proud to live in Montreal. I think this is the coolest city in Canada. But I think that as someone whose primary language is English and trying to learn, like I remember being at the hardware store once, and I had to buy some paint. I basically needed to know if this paint was better for interior or exterior, or like I needed to know some information about the paint, which is like a bit beyond my French-speaking capabilities. So I was talking to the guy working at the shop in English. I asked him in English, like, hey, could you tell me about this paint? Like, could it be good for this job? I was having a conversation, and he was speaking to me in English. His English was fine. But an older woman who was just like next to us, like later asked me, she's like, why don't you speak French? Why aren't you asking in French? And then I turned to her, I was like, and then I spoke French. I was like, parce que c'est un peu difficile pour moi pour cette conversation en français. And she's like, ah, mais tu parles français, c'est très bien. And then suddenly her attitude changed. She was like, oh, you speak French, this is good. Good for you. And like, she went from kind of criticizing me to suddenly being like, oh, you're cool, you're one of us. And I don't deny that English speakers have that same impulse sometimes. You know, cities like Vancouver, like you hear about people saying the same thing to Asians who are speaking Chinese and stuff. Like, I just think that the people in Quebec often have They have this historical grievance in mind. They have this kind of unease about the Canadian situation to begin with. And so they feel extra justified to like jump in and like jump down some English speaker's throat in some random situation like that. I don't want to scare English speakers who are watching this because like that was like over 2 years ago when that happened. It's not a regular occurrence. That hasn't happened to me. Like I can't remember the last time that's happened to me. But sometimes it's just the attitude. You just get the attitude feeling of like people are not so easy with you speaking English. But, and this is where I'm going to be more on the English side again for a second. Historically, there are English speakers in Montreal, like going back for hundreds of years. In the 1850s, there was a large Irish population who immigrated here during the potato famine in Ireland. And so for a long, long time, there have been English and Irish and Greek, the Greek community and Italian community. How could I forget the Italians? Used to be still is a large Italian population here too. To say that Montreal is just a French city that's becoming more English is also not necessarily true. It's just, it oversimplifies a situation of what really has been a cosmopolitan city for a long, long time. It's just because it's within this province of Quebec that is always like French first, you know? But Montreal itself has always been a bit of a weird child. It's not fully Quebec, it's not fully Canada, it's not fully anything. It's not fully English, it's not fully French. It's its own situation. So if you're an English speaker moving here, I think it's worth knowing this. And then you might have a bit more sympathy for the Quebecois who might seem unwelcoming to English at first. You might begin to understand where this comes from. On the flip side, if you are a French-speaking Canadian who is watching this, maybe you'll have a bit more sympathy for the English speakers who might move here. Part 4. Bilingualism is beautiful. I'll never forget when I just arrived in Montreal. It was the summer of 2019 and everything was fresh and new. I was downtown and I would hear these girls who grew up in Montreal talking to each other, walking down the street of St. Catharines, and they would be like, and then she said, mais pourquoi est-ce que tu dis quelque chose comme ça? And then he said, non, je veux pas parler. Like, they switched from English to French, back to English, back to French in a single sentence. And I was just like, wow, this is so cool. Sometimes we call it Franglish, like a mix of French and English. It's this thing that native Montrealers do, seemingly without even thinking about it. They just grew up surrounded by these two languages, and then they've kind of invented their own way of doing it. Now, for the hardcore identity-loving Quebecois, which I've focused a lot on in this video, that is kind of like the apocalypse. Like that, they don't want to see that. That's like the death of their beautiful language. For English speakers from other parts of Canada, it's confusing. They don't understand it. But for people who get to know the city, I think it's cool. I think it's beautiful. I think it's like just a very unique thing about Montreal that the city should be proud of. And so even though this video has focused on the problems surrounded by the language, don't get it twisted. In reality, this is one of the most accepting cities I've ever found in all my travels. Montreal is like truly an amazing multicultural place. And to keep that balance, there has to be respect shown to both sides. There has to be respect shown to the English speakers who are like generally like trying to make an effort. And there definitely has to be respect to the French speakers who grew up in Quebec and want to speak their native tongue, you know? And I think bilingualism is the beautiful solution. Just some effort made to accommodate from both sides, avoiding the like set in your ways, I only speak my language because I am, you know, leave that for the Americans. We're Canadian, we can do better. So what do you think? Did I solve it? Did I solve the language issue in Montreal? Probably not.
English side ruined. Must use French instructions.
Hope you enjoyed the video though, and I'll catch you next time. Peace.